Hello, a very warm welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Sanam Chantier. Our guest today is Fatimah Baeshen, Saudi Arabia's first female spokesperson who was recently appointed at the country's US Embassy. Now, that announcement came in September on the very day the Conservative Kingdom announced that the ban on women driving would be lifted. Now, prior to joining the embassy, Fatimah Baeshen worked for the Saudi Ministry of Labour. Previously, she was also a director at the Arabian Foundation, which is a Washington-based pro-Saudi think tank. And Fatimah Baeshen joins us from the American capital. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on France 24.
Thank you, Sanam. On behalf of the Saudi Embassy, I'm happy to be here.
Now, your nomination as a female spokesperson at the embassy is, of course, a first for your country. Would you agree that this was long overdue?
Well, I think what I can say is that this is a testament to how the leadership is leading and the trajectory of the country overall, where an average person like myself, regardless of background or gender, will be given this opportunity based on merit. And specifically for me, this links back to Vision 2030, when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced Vision 2030 in the spring of 2016. Yes, it's a long-term economic diversification plan underpinned by social and cultural reform, but it's also really kind of a rallying point that facilitates everyone being able to contribute based on interests and competencies.
Now, you've been in this post for less than a month, of course. Would you say that your role is indeed hands-on, or, as some critics have suggested, more of a symbolic position as part of this plan to overhaul the kingdom's image?
But no, absolutely not. So I will just echo kind of the sentiments of Ambassador Prince Khalid bin Salman, where he has specifically stated that he wants to be, his mission is to be ambassador to the United States at large, not just Washington, D.C. And that takes a comprehensive engagement strategy. So that entails engaging, obviously, the political market here in Washington, D.C., but also the business community, the American public at large, universities, et cetera, and particularly also the media. So my role is a supplemental function to supporting his objectives and the objective of the embassy to basically more dynamically engage the public in the United States.
Now, you've referred to yourself as a byproduct of the long-standing Saudi-US relationship, which seems to be going, frankly, from strength to strength. We had the biggest arms deal in American history signed earlier this year between the two countries. Saudi Arabia has just come out in support of Donald Trump's new Iran policy. Now, with these elements in mind, Washington has had a lot of leverage to pressure Riyadh on human rights. Just how much has that come into play?
Well, this is not necessarily about external influence, so this is very much about domestic and organic developments. So Saudi Arabia has leveraged for the last few years a consensus-building model to kind of drive the overall trajectory of the country. And so the government is issuing policies that basically mirror what's happening on the ground. And with respect to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, there has been a revitalization of that, but that's been institutionally fortified over the last 8 decades. And we've seen this throughout several different cooperations, be they economic, security, or even educational. So for example, there are 65,000 Saudis that are sprinkled throughout the United States studying as students. With respect to economics, there's over 70 billion US dollars of bilateral trade going between the two countries. With respect to security, both countries work side by side with respect to countering terrorists and countering terror financing. So it's a long-term kind of fortification of what we've seen previously over the last 8 decades.
Now, as part of this, of course, last month, Riyadh granted women the right to drive. Now, that will be effective as of June. And I have 2 questions for you. Firstly, why 10 months for the rollout of this policy? And secondly, we're seeing some contradictory reports about this. Will women first have to obtain permission from a male guardian to apply for a driving license?
So thank you for this question, Sanam. Actually, I'll tackle the first question and then we'll discuss the second one. So with respect to the 10-month run-up, this is really about facilitating implementation. So we're talking about potentially millions of new drivers on the road. So this requires finishing municipal works. This also requires augmenting the police force that's already existing on the ground. This also includes building driving schools, et cetera. So it's more about the institutional capacity build-up with that respect. In terms of misconceptions around around the announcement. So there have been several misconceptions around the announcement. You know, the age, the gender parity is the same across age. Excuse me, the age for obtaining a license is the same between both genders. It's not going to require guardianship. So it's exactly as the royal decree stipulated, which is that women will be able to obtain driver's license, full stop.
Okay, so this leads us to the next question, which is the broader policy of male guardianship. These are, of course, for those that don't know, a course of strict laws that mean women can't travel abroad or even work without the consent of their male relatives. How is the kingdom responding to calls to ease these particular laws?
So I think with respect to with the guardianship system, there are a lot of misconceptions around the guardianship system, and I've said this in several different spheres. So when we talk about women empowerment, really, if we break that down, it's about access, choice, and control. Saudi Arabia has made tangible strides with respect to women's rights in facilitating access to the public space. We've seen this in the labor market and the politic, and with respect to choice, so expansive in terms of being able to access different industries, et cetera. Where there are potentially room for improvement is control, and that's the guardianship system. But the guardianship system's application is very different than the institutional policy. But that's not necessarily the government perception. That's more about the.
But is that something that's being brought into question by the kingdom, and perhaps changes will be implemented?
If you'll just let me finish, then absolutely, yes, I'll get to that. So with respect to the application of the guardianship system organically is different than what the institutional policy calls for, but that's more about the cultural norms within a very specific microcosm, family or proximity within a very specific area. And so and to check this as a system of check and balances, King Salman issued a royal decree to double check the application, to review the application of the guardianship system. That's one. Another parallel to this is that in the spring of this year, Saudi Arabia was elected to the UN Women's Commission, which will also expand and hold the country to global standards. And so all of these are positive indication to the trajectory of women's rights in the country overall.
Okay, Fatimah Baeshen, we are seeing, as you mentioned yourself, various reforms implemented in Saudi Arabia. What about the argument that much of the change in policy, what's been dubbed as Vision 2030, again, you spoke about that, is actually due to pragmatic reasons? So the female population of the kingdom is some 14 million, and allowing them to get behind the wheel could boost the country's economy, certainly in light of a post-oil future.
So Vision 2030 has a permeable resonance. So there's something within Vision 2030 for everyone. And within that, the subtext to that is that it calls for the expansive matriculation of women into the labor market, into the workforce, because the leadership has recognized that to achieve these targets, the entire population is going to have to be leveraged. So human capital development is happening across the board. Now, this policy with respect to issuing driver's license for women will directly address and help facilitate achieving that target. And so what mobility was essentially a barrier into market entry, either from a cost perspective or from a logistical perspective. So women being able to get a driver's license themselves will facilitate achieving a target that was laid out in the vision, which is to increase the matriculation of women into the labor market.
And how is Saudi Arabia itself coping with the backlash from ultra-conservatives who still very much yield power in the country? I think I read a recent report about one ultra-conservative cleric who suggested that women are the cause of harassment and adultery. So it's still a largely conservative, patriarchal society.
Okay, so thank you very much for this question. I just would like to emphasize here that Saudi Arabia is a dynamic society, and within every dynamic society, there's a spectrum of opinions that exists. So be they conservative or progressive or everyone in between. Unfortunately, there are outliers that attract more media attention than others that are across the spectrum. And so, for example, with respect to the driving license issuances, the Supreme Council of Religious Scholars immediately issued a statement supporting the issuances of women obtaining driver's license, but unfortunately that did not attract a lot of media attention for some odd reason.
Now, what next for women's rights in the country? Is there anything on the agenda?
Well, I think that women have been able to achieve monumental feats, irrespective of not being able to drive. And I think, you know, I would invite all of us to kind of remove this myopic lens of women's rights from a driving perspective. So women have been able to contribute to science, they've been able to contribute to the politics, they've been mothers. There are professionals across the board. The stock exchange is chaired by a Saudi woman. So I think moving forward, the sky has been the limit and will continue to be the limit for Saudi women.
And looking beyond these reforms, lastly and very briefly, there have been promises of, quote, a return to moderate Islam. Can we expect to see Fatimah Baeshen, human rights abusers addressed in Saudi Arabia in the near future?
I think what we will continue to see is reform will be kind of governed by organic development within the kingdom. And I think that will be a positive kind of trajectory of where the country is going from a more holistic standpoint across the board.
Now, talking about this topic, is there any level of coordination with other countries in the region? We saw that the UAE recently appointed a number of women to its cabinet.
So it's not necessarily about coordination more so than it is about trends. So I think it's not just necessarily with women, but I think we've seen also a youthful trend across the region where there are younger people taking leadership positions, and then this also kind of pivots to other demographics, which also includes gender and of course women.
On that note, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Fatimah Baeshen, the spokeswoman for the Saudi Arabian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching this edition of The Interview on France 24.